Hi everyone, my name is Andrzej and thanks for coming to this talk. Today I'm going to talk a lot about stories, but not to how to tell them, because this has been covered extensively during the past CARE conferences. So I recommend to you to have a look on YouTube or on our archive just to learn how to tell stories. I'm going to talk about which stories to tell when working with the media. And when I was thinking how to kick off my talk, I thought about this setting, which is like really famous in Poland. So you have a family gathering, and you have your uncle sitting maybe at the head of the table, who's like this, really funny guy who likes to tell funny stories. The problem is that he's been telling the same story over and over again for the past 30 years. I bet all of you have a person like that in your family if you go to family gatherings. And it's a story that has been engaging maybe in the first year, maybe in the second year, when you've heard it. And you felt like this, okay, this is Uncle Tom, and he's going to tell us this great story again. But after 30 years, as I, for example, have heard the story how I was running with a pizza, tripped and fell into the box and smeared myself with pizza. I'm more like this when I'm hearing this story. I think there's a lot to be learned about this setting, this family setting when we work with, when we think about working with the press, and when you think about publishing investigations. So imagine that you've been working for the past, I don't know, few months, maybe a year, on a broiler investigation, and you have gathered really powerful footage that shows like the standard conditions in a broiler farm, and we all know these are animals who cannot make it through the few weeks they're being raised. These are animals who fall over the bag, fall on their bags and die. These are animals who just are bred sick and suffer in a systemic way. And then you have this powerful story, as you believe, and you go to the journalist, and the journalist, he or she isn't really interested in your story. And you're like, why is this person not interested in my story? Factory farming, and especially broiler farming, is one of the most important things that we, as a society, as people, could talk about nowadays. And it's something that we as a society need to talk about from all angles, like an ecological one, even a moral one. But he isn't just interested in it. And a heuristic to think about this, especially in countries where there's been a lot of investigations into factory farming, was to have coined the term like investigation saturation, or that the media are just saturated with the same materials over and over again. And I was like, I have to admit I've been thinking like that for some time, and was thinking like, yeah, this sounds plausible. But on the other hand, something didn't click with this narrative for me. And then last year I was listening to the 80,000 Hours podcast, where Rob Wiblin had Ezra Klein visiting as a guest. And Ezra Klein, besides being a really seasoned journalist, he's also a person who really cares about effective altruism, and he cares that the media tell the right stories and that they tell the important stories. So one quote that he said really sat with me. So he, as a journalist, said, if there's something important happening in the world and you can't make the audience interested in it, that's always our failure, and it's never the audience's failure. And this is like something that really rang a bell with me. Yes, of course it is our failure. Of course, it doesn't feel like that. We have all those self-serving biases where we try to push our failures on external factors, maybe I don't know, maybe people just don't care about animals. Maybe you find that the journalist is just stupid. Or think about other ways to excuse yourself why you cannot interest him. And of course, this is true. And the media landscape is a really, really complicated ecosystem. And there are a lot of obstacles that you need to face when you try to pitch a story. But I think there's a certain truth in what Ezra Klein said, or says and thinks, which is if your story sucks, if your story is repetitive, or it's just not interesting enough, you won't get into considering those obstacles because they won't be relevant for you because your story is just not newsworthy. And I think it's really, really important as people working with investigations to learn more about what is newsworthy and to consider these stories already at the point of planning. Of course, it's not like that everything we're going to discuss here is a magic bullet that will make the journalist publish every story going to pitch to him. But it will make it much more likely that he will have an open ear for you and will treat you less like this uncle who is telling this story over and over again. So, as already said, I really believe that we need to take into account this in the planning of the investigations, not to tell the same story, which is animals are suffering on the farms, which is a story that rings and resonates very much with us as activists, which resonates very much with us as people who care about animals and care about making the world a better place. But if we care making the world a better place, we need to think more and we need to incorporate more how the media work into the planning and execution of investigations. There's an important caveat here that we need to take into consideration, which is investigations are unpredictable. So of course you might start out planning a great story and in the middle of the investigation it turns out that there's just another story to be told. Maybe it will be a better story, or maybe another angle you believe will be better. But it's still, for me, it's still really crucial to think about what you're going to tell before you start telling the story. And when I was thinking about what to consider when thinking about which stories you want to tell, I looked a bit into literature. I looked a bit into professional advice, what people think newsworthiness is. And there's a lot of advice, but there's also a few pieces of advice or pieces of information that always repeat themselves. So I'm going to talk about a little about them, and I'm going to cover a few of those that I just find interesting or important to talk about from my experience. And I think the first one, it's pretty much known to everyone, I guess. It's timeliness, sometimes also referred to as relevance, and it's basically the backbone of news. So news outlets, they cover what is new, what is interesting, what is recent, what also refers to recent events. But also with media, with investigations throughout the years, what has established itself is something that I think of as seasonal investigations, which is, for example, that fur investigations are much more relevant in autumn, or egg investigations are more relevant during Easter season. And there are certain paths that we might take when we think about which story to run and when to run it. So timing is also very important. But in relation to the relevance of stories, I would like to tell you about a recent investigation that our Polish team published, which is a story into a slaughterhouse in the south of Poland. And I find it, and they pitched it to the biggest private TV broadcaster in Poland, TVN, which covered it extensively. They even hired their own investigator in that farm to make the story better. And what I find particularly interesting about this story is that when I was thinking about it, why did this story make the news, is that it's basically a follow-up story to a story that has been published in 2019 by the same outlet, which did a huge investigation on their own capacity into downer cows and the slaughter of downer cows. And it was a story about, of course, animal suffering. Obviously, this is something that we're talking about here all the time. But there are also other angles that were really important in that story and which made it impactful, because it was also a story about following animal welfare regulations. It was a story about food security. It was a story about sanitary conditions in slaughterhouses. All that directly relates to the consumer, and which makes it relevant to the consumer, who, if it was just a story about animal welfare, might just probably be a bit concerned, but then forget it later. And I think with this story, it's also interesting with follow-up stories. You're basically getting the whole story that happened before as the context for it, and it happened with this material as well. It was the context that they reported on, and you're just adding a small piece of information that is included into a bigger story that the journalists create on their own, which in turn turns then to a I would say pathway already of telling a story over a longer period of time, which we'll get to later. So basically, by covering this and uncovering that this is a systemic problem, framing it in a context that has already been reported on, the story was made pretty successful. I think another interesting point that I realized when I was thinking about the story might be the novelty of the technique, the investigative technique that has been used here. It is one of the first stories that I can think of in Poland being executed with only with a drone. And I have a feeling that having like this a bit of a James Bond vibe is something that that journalists click with very well. I've seen that with, I don't know, if you publish hidden camera footage, for example. Part of what makes the story interesting is also how this footage has been acquired. And I found that really interesting here, and it's a great job done here by the guys. The next angle that I'm going to look at is impact. And impact is basically the feature of a story that people oftentimes look at information that is going to impact their lives and have a direct impact of how they conduct their lives, on the choices they are making, and also what is somehow expected of them. How should they change their lives? For the better, for the worse? What should they do? What actions shall they take? And I think this is actually focused on the impact on the audience. It's one of the most powerful stories that we can tell as advocates, but also it's a very one of the hardest stories that we can tell as advocates. And this is, in my opinion, due to the fact that we have a very strong bias, and maybe not bias, but we feel very strongly about our cause area, which is animal welfare, which leads us to telling stories just circling the same story over and over again. And when researching this topic, I found a really useful tool that is being applied in newsrooms in many countries, the so-called so what technique. And it's really easy, and you can do it with your friends or colleagues. So when you're thinking about what you want to make the story about, you can apply this technique like this. For example, let's say we have acquired this broiler footage, and the story we really want to tell is animals are suffering on the farms. And then you get the pushback from the other person who asks, yeah, okay, so what? And you can then think about like, this is a huge problem for us as humanity. We really need to do something about it. And then the person can ask again, yeah, but so what? What should we do? And then you can think about an answer, something like, I don't know, we have to change as a society, change the way we treat animals, or whatever your reason would be. And you can see already that this is a story that might be interesting and impactful to someone who really cares about animals, and makes sense to someone who cares about animals. I believe it makes less sense to someone who doesn't share your values so much. And of course, the world isn't black and white, and there are journalists who care a lot about animals and to whom you could pitch stories like that, and they will be very successful. But I would like to show you how else you could pitch the story of having this broiler footage. Because you could always think about a story that is more oriented on the consumer, if you think that thinking about the impact your story will have on the lives of the consumers. So you could pitch it somehow like that. The animals in this footage, they end up on the consumer's plates on every day. And if you get this so what pushback, you can say the company that sells them actually sells them under false premise, making the people believe that what they're buying is animal welfare assured, and the animals have lived good lives. And with the so what pushback, you can reply again that the company is lying to the consumers and making consumers make choices that are based on lies. And this is actually a story that we told in the UK last year when pitching investigative footage from Morrison farms that supply to the retailer chain called Morrison's. That Open Cages UK ran a campaign against back then, and still do, I believe. And historically, the stories that are being told in the UK are more descriptive, so like more inclined into describing what can be seen on the footage, like more of a documentary rather than an engaging story. So what the people at Open Cages did is they concentrated around the story, around the welfare assured butcher on Market Street label, under which the Morrison sells their chicken, and decided to run a story that basically Morrison's is lying to their consumers and makes them conduct choices that they wouldn't otherwise do, so that under false premises, consumers basically contribute to animal suffering, which they probably wouldn't do if the company would tell the truth to them. And I think this is a very powerful story that we can apply more, or should apply more. And it, as said, ran really well in the UK. And I think when I was thinking about this one specifically, I think another small interesting detail is the creation of conflict, which is a really established narrative within literature, within film, basically within the stories that we as people tell to ourselves or between each other. So you can think about this like the story between good and evil, I don't know, Star Wars or whatever, about David versus Goliath, like basically the small or the good person who fights this greater evil, who is mischievous and tries to deceive everyone. And I'm really seeing this this trope here in this investigation, and this conflict trope, it creates a tension that is interesting to people, and it also makes them, to some extent, take sides in this story. And I do believe that they will take the side of the smaller party rather than a big one. Then we have proximity, which basically is the feature that people are more interested in the stories that feel closer to them. And I was thinking about it a lot recently. So there's been major pollution of Odra, which is the second biggest river in Poland, and got huge reporting throughout the last weeks. And at the same time, the exact same thing is happening, for example, in Bangladesh, where rivers are poisoned by the fashion industry, where thousands and millions of fish are dying continuously. But for some reason, it doesn't make news, and I don't even know the river that I looked up yesterday. I don't know what the name is. I don't know where it flows and stuff like that, because it seems very far away. And we're using proximity as an organization quite a lot as well. Less with investigations, more with our campaign, Stop the Farms. So we're running a lot of stories of communities, like this one in Kruszyniany, which fights the emergence of new factory farms. And I think even if it isn't related directly to animals, it still creates a context of talking about animal welfare and factory farms in general. Another classical application of the proximity is an example of an Equalia investigation into Aya supply chain, which was published earlier this year. And it got massive coverage throughout the globe. It was featured in German television. It was featured, I think, in most European countries and South America and many other places. And what they did is make a story that feels very much remote, like some Italian farm somewhere near Verona, more relevant to the consumer again by showing them where they can, in theory, buy products that originate from these conditions. And I think this is something we can also, and this is something we can plan out when conducting our investigations. What are the supply chains? Where does the company supply the products? So making it more about the proximity and availability and impact also on the consumers. Another one that I find quite interesting is superlativeness, which is basically running stories about the scale or intensity of events, because what is large or large in scope is oftentimes interesting. In our context, these are mostly stories of intense brutality towards animals, and I also think, as you can see, I have a lot of recent examples in my presentation, and one recent example is that of this cow farm in northeast Poland, which got into mainstream news last week, I believe, and it's a story of extreme neglect. It's a story about also authorities failing, but I believe that it made the news mostly because the story is so extreme. We can all see this is like not the norm. This is something that doesn't happen every day. This is a small farm somewhere, most people don't know where it is, but what makes it relevant is like this extreme cruelty that needs to be addressed, and it makes the story interesting. I think there's a similar touch with this slaughterhouse investigation by Viva, which covered the extreme brutality at a slaughterhouse in the north of the country. So I think I think also here one caveat would be that even if these stories make the news, I don't think they are very helpful in establishing like reporting paths, because you are basically reporting to some extent on singular events, on singularity, which in turn means that this won't happen again so often. And the last feature I really wanted to talk about really briefly is human interest. And I think this is something that is the least intuitive to people doing investigations, but also something that we should consider and shouldn't allow to be neglected as it is right now. And this relates to the fact that people mostly care about other people. It's that rude, but this is how we are wired as humans. Other people are like, we basically care what is most similar to us. You could even have establish a hierarchy of interest where you have like humans at the really top, then you would have animals, probably broken down into different species, ranging from big mammals down to insects maybe. Then you would have nature and inanimate objects. So I think if we're dedicated to telling interesting and compelling stories, we do need to tell this more often, at least human stories more often. We do need to step out of our comfort zones as investigators. I understand, of course, that sometimes it isn't possible because there are legal constraints or there are tactics applied that thrive on anonymity, which is fair, but still I do believe that we need to think about ways how we can run these stories. And one story that we did in this regard, and I think it was one of the most successful stories in the recent years, by Otwarte Klatki, is an undercover investigation into the biggest mink farm in Poland, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the world. And we made the story about Zhenya, this guy who worked there for around 2 months and documented the conditions there. But what made the story, we could have run the story based on the footage that Zhenya has documented, making it up about animal cruelty, making it about escaping minks, making it about people doing cruel things to animals. But by running this story through Zhenya's perspective, we gained exactly that, Zhenya's perspective of what he's experienced, but most importantly, what he felt, how he saw things, and what he experienced, and what this investigation, what it made to him. And I think this is powerful in a way that it's much easier for me to empathize with Zhenya than it is to empathize with the mink. And it's I understand his emotions better. So he's basically stepping into the role of a messenger here. A messenger who, to some extent, tells me what I should feel when I'm looking at this footage, tells me what also makes me mirror his emotions to some extent, because this is also what happens, that we basically, when listening to the stories, we tend to feel like to relate to this person. And he, to some extent, also just frames the story for us to receive. So we have been experimenting with this approach a bit. So we have this is another approach that we have with Andrzej Skowron, who is an investigator who works with us. And we noticed that people are actually quite interested in him as a persona, which means running stories on the investigators themselves is the news to the media, not so much what they are covering, but who they are, what drives them, what they feel when they are doing it. Basically, telling their stories, and through their stories, telling the stories of the animals. And with Andrew, it works really, really well. And I hope we can explore this path further. I think prominence is quite related with this, and it's basically based on the fact that people care about people, but people also care about prominent people they know. So, for example, I really like this story by Animal Equality, who invited Rune Mara to join them on a pig farm and on a broiler farm, and and to tell the audience the story through her eyes, and just to report on what she felt and what she thought and what it did to her visiting this, witnessing this intense cruelty. And it made headlines in the UK. Also, pretty nice story. So I don't think that like I covered a few of the angles that we can use. It's no way comprehensive. I think there are much more things to talk about. I do think, though, and I strongly believe that this is something that we should consider when thinking about investigations and when planning investigations. Think about the angles that you can use. Think about the stories that you want to tell. But at the same time, do not forget we're not getting a magic bullet here. Even if we learn to tell engaging stories, and we have really high expectations, and we think this is the best story and it's going to give message coverage, and we basically think that the journalists will react like that. Oftentimes, disappointingly, we get a reaction like this, which is like, yeah, okay, not impressed, maybe next month, maybe some other time, I think we have an interesting story, but not today. And of course, this happens because two factors, like they have a lot on their plate. They have decisions to make, which story to tackle and which to omit. It has also to do with the institutions they're working with. And this is also a concept I got from the 80,000 Hours podcast with Ezra Klein, which I found was really interesting. And this is a take that media outlets and the media as institutions, they tend to be more incentivized to report on stories that they've reported on before, and to report on stories that were relevant in the past. And that, unfortunately, way too often, they just lock in into the stories that they're reporting, and they have like this huge infrastructure of people working on the stories. So he gives the example of taxation, which you think of importance, like you have taxations and some I don't know, changes in taxes. Okay, important. Well, fair enough. But then you have climate change. Then you have animal suffering. Then you have, I don't know, AI, the whole topic of AI, or existential risks in general, which feels to us as people interested in this kind of things. It makes us think, why don't you report on that? And I think that if we see that there's a whole infrastructure of people who specialize in taxation stories. You have think tanks who are working in taxation stories, and making reports and all this boring stuff. You have commissions, like politicians working on that. It creates a whole landscape who nourishes on itself. And it makes it really hard to break through it. And I think what we should think about is creating paths for animal stories to get covered in the future. So, for example, I think one idea is to have follow-ups and to create new paths showing journalists that stories regarding animals are engaging, that stories regarding animals are important, and working with journalists continuously and kind of leading them by the hand to show that farm animal related stories are something that is important to report on. And the last point on which I wanted to touch upon, really, really briefly, I know that probably most of you are aware of it, is the attention economy, and this is something we all are working in, and it's something that we have to accept. But also the media outlets have to navigate. So basically, the attention of the audience is limited, and it's really hard to get. So unfortunately, they will go with the story that they find more engaging, that they think will generate more clicks, or will be just more interesting to the audience as they believe. So once again, I think thinking about how to tackle this, we need to think about creating engaging stories that we can explain in a good way, that this will really get the people's attention. And if there is one other takeaway that you should take out of this lecture, of this talk, is that you will fail. Like, we're failing all the time. We ran a few stories I can think of at least about 2 stories last year that I was really convinced are going to make the news and are great news, and in fact no one cared, which is really disappointing. I think also that we will get better if we think more about it and consider more what stories we want to tell, and if we keep just in the back of our heads when thinking about stories, just think about this uncle who tells the story every year, and just don't be like him. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the speech, and we'll move on to the question part. As mentioned before, you can ask questions through Eventory, and there's still a bit of time if you're willing. So first off, we have a question from Kasia. On the note of empathizing with human character, have you thought of telling the stories of people working in slaughterhouses more broadly to uncover the exploitation of people too, or finding a human hero who, for example, resigned, and could you tell the reasons why?
We thought about it, but I think these people are really hard to get. We actually do have an Otwarte Klatki, a whistleblower page that is directed directly on getting people like that, who would be willing to share their stories and how it was for them to work at this kind of operation. Basically, these are people that are really, it's not like you reach out to someone and they're just going to approach you. I can think of a story that Mercy for Animals ran. So they worked not with a slaughterhouse worker, but with a contract farmer on a chicken farm, and they convinced him just to talk about his engagement with one of the major producers. I think it was Cargill, and it allowed them to portray him as one of the as another person who's losing in the system. So basically, he's stuck in debt. He doesn't have a chance to get out of it. He's exploited by the company as much as animals are. And I think the focus of this was more on showing how corrupt and how broken the system of animal farming is. So I think I think these would be very powerful stories, but really hard to get. But working on it.
So another question from Konstantinos. Even if you have an interesting, substantiated and well-presented story, can it reach mainstream media if it is detrimental to big financial interests? Are media enterprises independent and impartial enough to present stories that negatively affect the farming and food industries, in your experience?
Good question. I would say I don't know. I believe that at least in established media landscapes, it is true that it is like that they're impartial enough to run these kind of stories. I do believe that this is why we need to keep media as much in public hand as possible, because there are, I'd say, more independent from private interests. Of course, they are not immune to private interests, but I guess to some extent it comes, of course, with other problems. But this is my thinking. I know about a number of countries where I've heard these arguments, that there are major players having monopolized the media landscape, for example, which makes it really hard to run stories that would contradict their interests. I think it might be true. I don't know enough about that. I think that a good way of thinking about it, I don't think I have a good answer, but a piece of advice that I would give is not to give in with this explanation that the media is corrupt and they don't care about it and they don't cover your stories because it contradicts some interests. Be curious about how the media function, be curious about the truth, how they work, and try to understand as much as possible the different relationships and the ecosystems in which they function.
Okay, and merging two questions. Do you have an example of an investigation that wasn't published and why? But conversely, what story did you find the most successful that you have worked on?
That wasn't published in the sense that the media didn't report on it, or that we, okay. Yeah. I think it was so we did an investigation in Bulgaria on mink farming last year, and it did really well in Bulgaria. And we also published it in the UK. And when I read the press release, I was like really convinced that this is a great press release and the angle is good, and that the story that has been told in this press release was quite engaging, but it didn't work. Probably Connor would know more why it didn't, but yeah. But I was just really surprised, because I was quite confident that it will maybe not make headlines, but will be quite a nice story, I guess, having taken the angle that we decided to take. And what was the other question?
An example of a story that you felt was most successful, and why?
I think the story that I covered in my talk about Żenia, I think it was is one of the most successful stories that we have told, both in terms of media interest, of international interest, but also of the political reaction that it led to, or that it was accompanied with. So basically it was published on the same day that a bill to ban fur farming has been introduced in Parliament. And we knew, of course, that that the ruling party was working on this bill and that it was to be presented quite soon. But I've heard some opinions that they decided to speed up the presentation just to capitalize on the interest that the investigation had. And yeah, I think a direct or impact of that investigation was that it led to a development that almost led to the banning of fur farming in Poland, which in the end didn't happen due to political considerations. But I think this was, I guess, one of the most impactful stories that we've run so far. Or the one that is available to me right now.
Thank you for that. And another question. How do you see the role of social media in publishing investigations? So do you think publishing an investigation on a large YouTube channel, for example, would have more impact than a big media outlet?
I don't have a lot of experience with publishing on YouTube. From what I've seen so far, it didn't work very well when we published on YouTube only. I think that traditional media still play a major role as a amplifier of your stories. Their role changes, of course, but it's still, in my opinion, it still is the leading medium and the leading amplifier that we should look at.
Thank you for that. Another question, if you're still fine answering some more, would be related. Do you think that fast-paced online media is the best place for investigations, or are there alternatives?
I don't know, but this is something I think the thing is that, as what I mentioned before, is that we are competing with attention, for attention all the time. And I think for some approaches maybe, so if you had like really powerful footage, for example, with this angle of like the one, if you had like really brutal footage, for example, that with an intense scope, where you believe that it had the potential to go viral, for example, I would probably consider it, maybe, and see what happens. If you didn't think that that it would interest traditional media, I think that, yeah, basically, as you know, social media mostly thrive on emotions. So if you are on strong emotions, so if you had a story that you believe would you could frame in a way that will evoke strong emotions, which like this footage, which is really intensive, could. I think it has a chance. Like the caveat here is that it will probably disappear quite quickly as well, which, yeah, it could be tried. Or if anyone else has thoughts, I'm happy to learn more.
And another question, how much of the work for getting a story out, in your experience, is direct contact with different journalists compared to like a general press release?
I don't think I understand the question.
I'm assuming it's about the difference between just writing a press release and being able to release it, whereas it does seem from your presentation like you need contact with journalists.
Yeah, I think reaching out to like individually to journalists is of course much more work, but it also reaps bigger benefits. I think for many reasons. One of the reasons is that you can get the journalist emotionally involved into the story. And I think this is also what happened with the Żenia story, where it was pitched to the journalist quite early in the process, and it allowed him to make a story of his own based on it. So when working with journalists, you basically get a bit into the role of this the classic role of a whistleblower or an informant that just gives information to the journalist, and the journalist, he or she just acts upon it. Means that this person develops a story of his or her own based on the information that he got. He goes to other sources, he tries to confirm it, and basically it's becoming his story, which makes him more engaged, which makes also the outlet more willing to push this story, I guess. So this is something you're not getting with a press release, which is sometimes just copy-pasted into the online presence. I think what also is really important to see here is the direct relationships you building with journalists when working with them. And this is something that we need to think more about. That the journalist that you're contacting, he's like not just your tool of getting the story out there. He's probably more of a partner that you're willing to work with right now. But you should also design your cooperation in a way that he will be willing to work with you in the future. So if you're pitching a good story to the journalist, and for example, you're pitching a scoop story to the journalist with which he is very successful, which will of course mean that the story that you're pitching is well researched, it's engaging, all that. And who probably will be more inclined to work with you in the future, which in turn will make you more likely to publish more farm animal related stories. And I think this was something when I was thinking about this path dependence that Ezra mentioned in his talk, and I talked really briefly about, which is creating our own pathways of publishing investigations and creating our own historical reference points within the media outlets, which means that outlets will basically publish the story, will be more inclined to publish a story because they have published a similar successful story in the past. And this is something I'm thinking very much about right now, and I think it has a great potential to be looked more into it, so that we can make this path dependence to work more into in our favor. And this is also something that I've seen happening with many journalists before, and I know organizations who have like I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 journalists that they're working on with all the time, and who are just the guys who are publishing their stories and are really successful with it. So
Okay.
this is it takes more time, but the benefits are potentially much greater.
So for our last question of the session, any tips for making investigations from other countries relevant if you can't directly link to the supply chain in your country?
I don't think I'm not sure if I can give general tips. It should probably be considered case by case, as every story does. So yeah, I don't know. I'm happy to start a conversation, but I don't have any any general tips. Sorry.
Right. In that case, thank you for attending and thank you for your questions, and warm round of applause for Andrzej Pazgan for the talk.